Hello and welcome. This is the adult Sunday school lesson for First Baptist Church at Alabaster. It's the Bible Studies for Life curriculum for July 19, 2020. The title of the lesson is How Should I Respond to Politics? We're in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. And this actually is the same lesson as the Explore the Bible lesson that we had back in May. So the Bible Studies for Life folks, y'all will be getting the same lesson. I hope that you have your copy of the Word of God and have turned to chapter 13, and we'll begin reading at the first verse. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all who is owed to them, or pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Now we know from the biblical record that Paul and other first century Christians sometimes clashed with civil authorities. Yet in this first verse, verse 1, Paul tells Christians in Rome that they should regard civil government as something that God has instituted for the purpose of promoting the common good and punishing wickedness. The verses we are studying this week provides an opportunity to explore a question that is as old as Christianity itself. How should Christians relate to the earthly government or governments? There's a movie made in 1941 called One Foot in Heaven. It's a story of a Methodist minister who dealt with a series of typical crises as he moved from one parish to another parish. This movie reflects the double life of Christians whose citizenship is in heaven, though they live on this earth. Paul himself experienced two different sides of governmental authority. He sometimes suffered at the hands of civil authorities who abused and imprisoned him, but he also appealed to his rights as a Roman citizen. Consider this. A church member in a small country church made this comment to his pastor: I just don't understand, or rather, I just don't think politics has any place in the pulpit. Is that a correct statement? Would you agree with that statement? What is the proper relationship then between church and politics, between religion and government? These are questions that are not new. The book of Romans expresses some strong writing on this subject, and we're going to be studying these verses, and perhaps it will help clarify this role of Christian citizens in today's world as we address these a few church versus state issues, if you will. Let's look at the first 5 verses and ask this question. What attitude should Christians have toward government? Christians are to accept the authority of the state and its officials as something that has been appointed by God. Rebellion against the civil power is rebellion against God and will lead to punishment. That's a pretty strong statement for the scriptures. Only wrongdoers or only lawbreakers need to fear the power of the state. The way to avoid feeling the wrath of the state is to do what is good rather than do what is evil. Now, in some areas of the world, we know that people fear their government. This attitude toward the state is appropriate because the state is a minister of God. Or better stated, governments are a servant of God, or should be. The government should promote good, it should punish evil, and it should maintain social order. And I know we all have questions about our government today, but anyway, we will move on. Our motive to submit to the authority of the state should not be that we fear its power alone. It is a matter of conscience as well, because we are to regard the state as being ordained of God. I want you to consider Iraq and Saddam Hussein. We went to war in Iraq in the early 2000s. Saddam Hussein was the leader. There was a no-fly zone in certain areas, and Saddam Hussein began to go across and into those no-fly zones to the point that our government and many other governments of the world decided something needed to be done, so we invaded Iraq. And so doing, Iraq became a place of chaos. And I say that for this reason. In Iraq, there was a large population of Christians. It was probably one of the largest, I believe it was the second largest population of Christians in the Middle East at the time. Well, this war caused a chaotic time to where when one time a Christian family would live next door to a Muslim family and they would live there in peace. But during this chaos, Christians began to be run out of their homes and many even killed. And to this day, they still haven't been able to go back to their homes. Many fled the country of Iraq altogether, while others went to the north and may still be there. I really don't know. But it did disrupt the chaos that enveloped the government that fell. There was no government. So, of course, chaos ensued. And there was no protection for the Christian families, but there was no protection for other faiths that were in Iraq as well. Even the two different Muslim groups fought against each other. The Sunni and the Shiite Muslims fought against each other. So even though it was a very evil government, and that was Saddam Hussein who had an evil government, it was still used of God to maintain order. But when chaos ensues, then there is no order and there is no peace, and many people can be mistreated under these situations. Moving on. Verses 6 through 7. What do Christian citizens owe the government and its leaders? Government officials, as servants of God and society, require financial support through taxes. It is their due, verse 7 says. Consider the teaching of Jesus in Mark chapter 12, verse 17. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Government officials also deserve our respect. It seems that anyone who occupies public office at any level today is going to become a target for criticism. Is that a good or is that bad? Does the barrage of criticism keep them honest, or does it make it difficult for them to do their job? Just asking the question. Now, in reading 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 through 2, it says, "First of all, then, I urge that supplication, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. It is our responsibility as believers to pray for our leaders, both in the church and within the government, local, state, and our nation." Moving to the next question. Are there circumstances in which Christians should not submit to government authority? Paul did not limit his argument for loyal citizenship to good or Christian states. Most Roman rulers were thoroughly pagan, but Paul apparently thought that even repressive governments, such as the one I mentioned earlier in Iraq, were preferable to total anarchy and chaos. The relative stability of the Mediterranean world, enforced by the power of Rome at the time, played a major role in Paul's ability to travel with the gospel message to all parts of the empire. Paul's instructions for loyalty to earthly rulers seems to rest on the assumption that they are committed to justice, upholding the good, and punishing evil. When a state officially sponsors evil and opposes what is good, Christians will need to rethink their position. Consider Acts chapter 4, verse 18, where the local leaders in Peter and John's day commanded them not to speak to people about Jesus. Their response, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen or to them rather than God, you must judge, for we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. As with Peter and John, shouldn't we too joyfully bear witness of what God has done for us through Christ, our Savior? Even if governments tell us we can't, we should share Jesus with others. Looking at Romans 13, verses 8 through 10. Verse 8, the command to not owe anyone anything except to love one another stresses the importance of love in the Christian life. Jesus declared that the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love one another. For the believer, love is not an option. Some view the first part of this verse as Paul forbidding any kind of debt. While this interpretation is quite clear and can be agreed to, the statement can also require the honoring of one's debts and faithfulness in repaying what one owes according to the terms of the contract. Now, emphasizing verses 9 through 10, the person who loves his neighbor will never dream of injuring him by taking his wife or taking his property or his good name or his life. In this sense, love is the fulfillment of the law. The ideal would be to live in a society ruled by love. But we live in an imperfect world, and we must depend upon an imperfect government. Moving on to verses 11 through 14. The night is far spent, is the phrase in the King James Version. Reminds us that the present evil age is temporary. The day of God's redemption is at hand. So verse 12 tells us. Therefore, believers should live as citizens of heaven even while living on this earth. As believers, our walk and or lifestyle should be marked by decency. Paul is not talking about the world's idea of proper behavior. Proper Christian behavior is defined by the truths of the light brought to us in Jesus. Our standards should differ from the world's standard, in other words. Going a little further, What the above statement means, the night is far spent. Specifics are stated in verse 13. Sexual immorality, chastity, was almost unknown prior to Christianity. In other words, chastity or morality, I guess I should say. Being sexually pure was not seen as a virtue to most people in the first century. In many respects, it seems as though we have returned to the first century in many parts of our society. Debauchery dealt with public displays of immoral acts without shame. Dissension was a desire for power and prestige by any means of dishonesty by stirring up the people. And that's one thing I see happening today. There's many in our society right now stirring up the mobs of people for their own purposes. And we need to be careful. Let's use our minds and certainly use our hearts, if we know Christ, not to conduct ourselves in that way. Jealousy. This is envying others and begrudging others for their success or position. I was talking with some of our chaplains the other day at the sheriff's office, and one of the chaplains asked one of our African American brothers his take on what was going on in our society. He certainly didn't agree with what was going on, but he made a statement that I thought was very good. He said that I would never hurt you to get what I wanted. He said that would be wrong, and that certainly is a Christian statement. In other words, if I'm seeking to be better, or I'm seeking for better things for myself, I'm not going to hurt you in order to get those things. I thought that was pretty wise. But there is this attitude of jealousy in some areas of our nation by some individuals. And I think that's being stirred up by people, and emotions are getting involved. But anyway, as Christ followers, we actually have a choice. We can be intentional and choose to be good citizens. We can choose to act in loving ways. We can choose to be good neighbors. Question, what have you chosen? Chuck Colson once said, while the Christian is not to return evil for evil, he must instead exercise forgiveness, breaking the cycle of evil. But he may participate in the God-ordained structure that restrains evil and chaos of the fallen world by use of force. Would you agree with that statement? And then I would ask you why or why not. It's a good question. Another question I'll leave you with is, what's the difference between submitting to authorities and unconditionally obeying them? What's the difference between submitting to authorities and unconditionally obeying them? Good question to consider. Well, I hope this lesson has been somewhat helpful to you. I hope it's been an encouragement to you. And allow me to leave you with this. Many of us find ourselves in a state of anxiety and worry these days, but the scriptures tell us not to be anxious. And we're to be anxious for nothing. Some of us are also wondering what God is doing. And some may even be asking God, what are you doing, Lord? God most likely is not going to tell you or me what he's doing. What's important in this time, in a time like this, or any time really, is that God will reveal to you who he is. He is a miracle-working God, and I pray that you are surrendered to him. Again, my prayer is that you will experience the peace of Christ today and the days ahead.